Today is September 30th, 2014. My name is Janice Sherman, and I'm interviewing Karen Hollweg, who's going to talk about her experiences during the flood of September 2013. This interview is being recorded for the Maria Rogers Oral History Program, and it is being filmed by MROHP. Karen, can you start by stating your name and telling us where and when you were born?
Karen Hollweg. I was born in Bakersfield, California in 1943.
And what brought you to Colorado?
It was a job-related move. I had lived in California the entire time I was growing up and during my college education. And my first job was in California. And then I taught in Massachusetts for a while and eventually got married and moved to Colorado with my husband, who had a job at the university.
So you came into Boulder.
Right, yeah. Moved from Massachusetts to Boulder.
Great. And how long have you been living here then?
Since the mid-70s.
Okay. And your current house that you're living in, did you move into that at that time?
I moved into the townhouse that I live in now a couple years after moving to Boulder, so it was in the mid to late 70s.
Great. What would you say about that particular subdivision and community?
The set of townhouses that I live in is called Shanahan Ridge 2, and the whole southern border of the city was developed sequentially by one of the major developers here in Boulder. And our units, which are directly across from Fairview High, were the first units of that development that then goes on up Shanahan Ridge. And at the time I bought it, I was very concerned about water and earthquakes, because those were in the news. So I went to the city and looked at the planning maps and talked to the city geologist and to Ruth Correll, who was the mayor at the time, or city councilwoman. And I found out that there was a seep on the ridge there, but that there were no geological concerns from an earthquake perspective and soils perspective as far as the geologist knew. And so because the unit that I purchased was far away from the seep, I really wasn't concerned about it. I knew it was there, and it went off the ridge down into the Shanahan farm. So I felt very comfortable purchasing the unit that I did and knowing that it would be on good solid ground.
So the terrain, just to be clear here, the townhomes just back to open space, essentially, or to the ranch.
That's right. Yeah. They overlook the Shanahan Ranch and South Boulder Creek.
And there's a slope to the...
And they're up on a ridge, so it's highland.
Right. And is there a sense of a neighborhood with your neighbors? And has that changed over time from the 70s to now?
No, I think it's been pretty consistent. There are still some of the original owners, like myself, that still live there. As with any development in this city, they've changed over time, and there are new people that come in, and some residents move out. Births and deaths and all the things that happen in any neighborhood.
And has there always been an HOA in place?
Yes. The covenants for the HOA were part of the original development.
And when you bought your house, was there any discussion? Obviously you'd done your research, but was there any discussion about potential flooding or anything in place to prevent that?
No, it was a couple years after I bought my unit that they developed further on up the ridge where the swale was located. And there were no units built right where the swale was. And so none of us gave any more thought to it. until several years later when there were some units further up the ridge that had problems with water in their basements. And at that time, French drains were put in on the south side of those units to convey the water away from the basements, and we felt that that was all fixed,
But that was just
fixed
for,
and taken care of. That was
just for a part of the
just for a part of the development.
Uh-huh,
and it was, I can't tell you what year it was at least 15 or 20 years ago.
Okay. Well, why don't we turn to the rains last year? You can start by telling us where you were.
Well, I was in Europe, actually, at a 50-year reunion with some college friends. And I flew back in from Copenhagen on September 11th.
Oh.
Took the AB bus in from the airport and then transferred to the skip to go down to my place. And in the process of getting off of the AB bus and getting across the Table Mesa Broadway intersection to get on the skip, I got very, very wet because it was just pouring rain. And standing at the skip bus stop, I had an umbrella, but I was under trees and under the umbrella. And cars and trucks were coming along and just splashing huge waves of water onto me and the sidewalk and my luggage and everything else. And I remember thinking, geez, this is wet. I'm going to be sopped when I get home, and I hope everything inside my suitcase is not as wet as I am. So it was obvious to me that it was really wet when I arrived back in Boulder. And by the time I got inside, the first thing I did was open up my suitcase to see if I could dry things out and figure out how wet things were. That was on the 11th, and by the 12th, I don't know, less than 24 hours later, maybe 12 to 18 hours later, a neighbor said, "Karen, is your basement wet?" And I went down and took a look at the place that it had gotten a little bit wet 20, 30 years earlier. And sure enough, it was getting very wet. And I said, "Tell me what's going on." And she said, "Well, it's been raining for days, and there are a lot of parts of the city that are flooding. So I've been checking my basement, and you need to go check yours." And so as soon as I checked mine and realized the extent of the flooding that was going on in my basement, I ran next door and asked the neighbors on either side if they were flooding. And then I decided, this is more than just me and Sally who lives over there. And so I went door to door and said to people, check and see if your basement's flooding, take care of it, and as soon as you can, grab a shovel and come out in front. And a whole brigade of us, virtually everybody, people who were being flooded and people who were not, came out on the south side of our row of townhouses on the top of Shanahan Ridge and started digging trenches. And it was a huge community project.
How many of you were there?
Well, it's hard to say. That development is really extensive. I think there are over 100 units altogether down the ridge. In the block that I'm in the cul-de-sac that I'm in, there are 12, let me think for a minute. There are 12 units right on the edge of the bluff, overlooking the bluff. And so, with one or two exceptions, all those parties were out in front, plus some of the people that live between the edge of the bluff and Greenbrier Boulevard had heard that we were out there and came out with their shovels. So there must have been, 12 to 15 people anyway, out there with shovels. And some groups had people back inside. One of my neighbors had a teenage daughter with a wet vac who was inside trying to keep up with the water in their basement. So some people were inside working on what was going on inside, and some people were outside.
And so tell us how that project went, which you were the mobilizer of your brigade.
Well, it was really fascinating to sort of, I wanted to just watch what was going on. But in the meantime, I was trying to do something constructive inside. And I was also phoning the city to find out whether there were any things like sandbags or whether there was any resource that we needed to know about. And I immediately found out that, you're on your own. There's nothing that we're going to provide for you because we're busy with other floods that happened yesterday. And but there were three groups, I think, that were really fascinating to key in on and what they were doing. There was a group of college, there's a younger woman who usually has 2 or 3 roommates at any one time. I don't know, 5 or 6 units west of mine. And she had some friends who were helping her. So there was a group of like 4, maybe 5, 20-something kids out there with shovels at the highest point in our section. And they were doing a great job making a ditch that carried water across the sidewalk, which is between the townhouses and the edge of the ridge, across the sidewalk, and then on across the little patch of open space, illegally of course, and down off the bluff into the Shanahan farm. And the way they got the water to go across the sidewalk was they took the chunks of turf that they had dug up from the grass and lined a canal across the sidewalk to make a barrier, a little dam for the water to channel the water across the sidewalk. 2 other men who are probably in their early 40s were very constructive and cogent about what they were doing. They both obviously had had a lot of experience with shovels. And they were building their channels cooperatively because one was coming from up here and one was coming from down there, and they made them meet so that they could go together and in a constructive way, and every once in a while they'd talk about strategy and then they'd proceed. There were 2 older men and a couple women that were in front of my unit and further down. And since I live alone, I was trying to be inside and take care of things going on inside and going outside to see what was needed or what progress was being made out there. And this group in front of my unit and further down slope was trying to build their canal through the roots of a pine tree and uphill. And I noticed it, and then I went back inside to do something, and then I came back out. And they weren't making much progress, and what was happening as a result is the water was flowing back down and making a lake at the corner of my unit. And I ran downstairs and I thought, oh, it's coming in faster and faster and more. I've got to get rid of that lake or it's just going to keep infiltrating my basement more. So I went back up and said, something's got to happen to drain the water out of this lake and further down slope. How about putting the canal that way? And the guys said, no, we're going this way so we can get it like they're doing and get it to cross the sidewalk and go off the bluff. And I said, it's not going to work, it's uphill. The water won't go uphill. And my neighbor heard me yelling at these other people because it was still raining, pouring rain. and he came over to see what was going on. And I said, we've got to get the water out of the lake going downhill. And he said, she's right. And then he started working with his shovel to dig the way that it could go downhill. And they then followed suit with that plan. But it was a real exhibition of people's understanding of how water flows, how to make canals and dams with turf, and cooperation in working groups of 2 to 3 or 4 people. And the camaraderie and joint purpose that everybody had out there was remarkable. Because everybody was pitching in whether their unit was involved or not. A couple of the men who were very capable with shovels were from units that were not affected. And they have reminded me multiple times over the last year, remember that day? We were out there digging. So I think everybody, that set the stage for the next few days, which were really not very happy days. And we did a lot of sharing of knowledge and sharing of encouragement among people in the neighborhood. And the Homeowners Association played a really important role in those first 2 days. They did 2 things. They created a plan for how to deal with wet carpet and padding, which we virtually all had. And they gave you the phone number for FEMA and told you that you have to phone both your homeowner's insurance and FEMA to file claims. And so within the first couple of days, I had phoned my insurance company, phoned FEMA, made an appointment for those people to come out and started tearing out my carpet and padding with the help of some real angels that came along. The first night after the trench digging episode, I don't remember when in there it stopped raining, but I took a sleeping bag and slept in my upstairs floor. My bedroom is downstairs and my office and den and bathroom are downstairs. And upstairs on the dry floor is my living room, dining room, kitchen, half bath. And so I took a sleeping bag and slept up there, sort of. And before I really went to sleep, I decided, you know, I'm going to need some muscle to help me tear out this carpet. And so I sent emails to all the people that I knew in Boulder who I thought might either know or have in their family teenage kids that might be able to come over and help me. And since I had no idea where in town it was flooded or not, I just picked, you know, people who I thought had teenage kids or knew of teenage kids. And I sent emails to a couple batches of those kind of people saying, I'm flooded, I need help, you know, let me know if you have any teenage kids. I need some muscle to help me tear out carpet and padding. And the next morning, as soon as McGuckin's opened, I went down to McGuckin's because I'd figured out that I needed to have a wetback. And I went down there and was at the door along with many other people. Went in and got a big fan and a wetback. They only had smaller wetbacks. They had a truck coming with bigger wetbacks, but I said, I'm not waiting, and I got a medium-sized wetback. And hauled those 2 things home and took them downstairs and put them together and tried to figure out how to start while manning the phone and checking my email to try to get help. And that day I ended up with 2 or 3 high school kids. The next day I had 2 college kids, and one of the high school kids came back with a friend. So, and then on top of those kids, one of the people that I had emailed to is a longtime friend who lives how to explain it? He lives just north and west of Boulder. And he was not in an area that was flooded. So he phoned and he said, Karen, I'm on my way over. And he showed up with everything in his vehicle that he could have ever needed, and I could have ever needed. And he spent the entire day with me. And then he went to, where did he go? He went to Staples and to the lumber store. And he brought back a whole bunch of packing boxes and a whole bunch of lumber, because our plan was, as soon as we had the carpet and padding torn out, we would put the furniture up on lumber just so it would be off the wet cement, so that if it rained again, the rain could come in and be on cement. In the meantime, I'm phoning my friend in Washington, D.C. and saying, I don't know that I can handle this. It just seems overwhelming. I don't know what to do next. I'm getting exhausted. And so he hopped on a plane, and 2 days later he showed up. And I canceled my flight because I was supposed to only be in Boulder for 2 days. And then go back to Bakersfield, California, where my 97-year-old mother was living alone in her home. And I had been living with her that whole year, 2013, helping her out and helping her through a real medical crisis. And I had arranged during the 2 weeks I was at the 50th reunion to have other people cover that responsibility. But I was supposed to, on what was it, September 14th, I was supposed to fly from Denver back to Bakersfield, California to be with her for the duration. And so my friend from DC helped me cancel that flight, or delay that flight. And I spent the next week in Boulder and phoned people in California and said, you know, you just got to take care of my mom in California because I'm here. So I spent 1 week in a very concerted, focused effort to try to take care of what needed to be done with my flooded basement in Boulder. One of the first things I did was I had my townhome retrofit, and I had a major energy retrofit and renovation 2 years earlier. And I said to myself, oh my God, we're taking out all this carpet and padding, and if I can't get matching carpet, I'm going to really be up the wall in a really bad place, because I'm going to have to recarpet everything rather than just recarpet the basement. So I phoned Carpet Exchange. I think that was a couple days later. And I talked to the manager, who was doing a land office business at this point, but I was pretty much ahead of the curve. And I said, here's the specs for my carpet. Is that carpet still in stock? And he checked on his computer and he said, yes, it is. There's some in Georgia. I said, I want to place an order, and I want to place it now before it runs out, because I have matching carpet and I need to have that to replace the flooded carpet. So he came out within a day or two, did all the measurements, placed the order, so I knew that I had carpet on hold. And I said, you're going to hold this until some months later when I can use it, right? And he said, sure. The other things that happened within the next couple of days were the insurance adjuster came out, the FEMA man came out. I called I spent a lot of time on the phone trying to get the water damage and whatever those people are called, they're listed in the phone book.
Restoration.
Restoration, yes. Flood restoration people. And at this point, that was a real circus, because people were coming door to door offering their services, and you had no way of knowing whether they were reputable, what their story was. you know, some people would say, we have trucks coming from Texas. We'll have trucks here tomorrow. We can help you. Just sign up now. And I thought, I'm not doing any of that. I got very nervous about all that. So what I did was I phoned the 2 contractors who had helped me with the energy retrofit renovation. And I said, here's the deal. My basement's flooded. The drywall's wet. I need to redo my basement now. Can you help me? And they said, are you kidding? We're booked up for months. I said, no, no, no. You have to help me because you have to come over and you have to give me a bid. I am flying out of here within days. I've got to get back to California. It doesn't have to be done right away, but you have to tell me what to do to put it on hold this week. And then you can do it whenever you want, because I'm going to be living with my mom in California. And so I got the 2 contractors to come over to assess what needed to be done, to prepare bids for me. What else did I do? I made a little list of all the things that I got done that week, which was just chaos in my mind.
And just while you're looking at that,
Yeah.
there was no flood insurance for your development. You were not in the flood zone.
No.
Okay, so
we were high up on a
Yeah.
ridge. we were safe, real high.
So when you talk about insurance, it was
no
your homeowner's
insurance.
insurance.
And the homeowner's insurance adjuster who arrived said, boy, you're really fast. You know, I'm at the first of my list and I'm getting calls every day, and I said, well, I've got to get out of town. And he said, well, here's the deal. I have to write you a letter saying you're not covered for anything, and that you need that letter to give to FEMA. And I said, okay. And the FEMA guy said, and I said, I just talked to my insurance adjuster. He's generating a letter for me. Fine, do this and do that. And so I got my FEMA claim completed and the inspector for that done. I got the carpet ordered. When my friend from Washington, D.C. arrived, like 2-3 days after the flood, what we did then was we created a storehouse in my garage. And we moved all the furniture that was up on these little wood blocks in my basement into the garage. We boxed up all the things that were in my basement that were not sopping wet and already in the dumpster into the garage. So we had tiers of boxes, and then we had furniture, and then we had all the clothes from my closet rigged up on a pole across the garage, and the garage became everything from my basement that may be redeemable. So we got that done in that week, and by the end of the week, the basement was literally stripped empty. The contractor had sent somebody over to take out the worst of the wet drywall, so that the drywall was out, the carpet and padding were out, and it was pretty much an empty shell in the basement. And I said, okay, you guys get to me the bids on the work that needs to be done. Email them to me. I'll be in California. And I flew out to California, and my friend flew back to Washington, D.C. And the one other step that we took before that happened was we sprayed everything with a Clorox and water mix, like one of the contractors said we should do, to stop mold. And the fans were running. And I left.
And was there someone stepping in to monitor this, or you just left it at that point?
Well, my neighbor Sally, who had placed the first call to me, was going to be there for a few weeks, and then she had a trip that she was going to be gone for a month or so. Mm-hmm. So she watched long enough that she knew the fans were still going. You know, I don't know whether she came in once a day or once every few days, but the fans kept running and the Clorox kept smelling. in the meantime, in the next week or two, I got the bids from the contractors and I negotiated them long distance, and we agreed on a timeline that by the end of the year they would try to have it done. And so all that was set in motion. The other thing I did from California is I did a lot of research on materials, because there were issues about what kind of material should be put between the cement slab on the bottom of the basement floor and the cement slab on the wall siding. And that's called something that I can't remember right now. But the kind of material, you have to leave that space movable. It has to functionally be able to move. And the contractor that I was working with said, you know, we need to fill that in if we're going to waterproof the cement on the walls and the floor for future retardant, and to try to prevent this from happening again. We also need to do something with that crack. So I did a lot of online and telephone research with companies that develop and sell that kind of stuff, and talked to some very knowledgeable people and identified what I thought sounded like the best stuff, and then would forward that information to the contractor and say, I think we ought to use this stuff, and he'd check it out, because he didn't have time to do that. He was running around to too many clients trying to save their homes.
So you became an expert in
So I became an
construction.
expert in materials to use for, yeah, and what stuff to put on the cement to waterproof the cement, and what, you know. And during that period of time, while all that was going on in October, my mother and I were having serious discussions about finances and about where she would be living, because she was out of her crisis period with her health. And we went and looked at retirement communities in Bakersfield, and I have a sister out 45 minutes away from my mother, and we all agreed that it would be best for her to move into a retirement community. And so I was dealing with that, as well as a professional conference and a professional trip related to that, and it was really a pretty stressful, chaotic time in my life because of all these things that were juggling around. But by December, by the end of November, the contractor said, "You're good to go." So I phoned the carpet people, arranged for the carpet installation in early December, got a friend who's an interior designer in Denver to come out and spend the day supervising the carpet installation. The theme through the whole thing is there were lots of friends. And then in January, well, my mother moved into the retirement home in mid-December, and I spent a lot of time, you know, moving her and trying to get her settled in a new location. And about mid-January came back here to pay final bills to all these people who had done all this work that I was very nervous paying making final payments to before I saw what was happening, and got all the little final things fixed that needed to be perfected to make them just right. And then my friend from Washington, D.C. showed up again, and we spent 4 or 5 days taking the furniture, well, first of all, cleaning off all the drywall dust from everything and cleaning down all the dusty stuff from the garage, and putting the furniture back into the basement on top of the new padding and carpet and drywall. And and trying to get enough unpacked and back in the townhouse that it was functional. We must have taken, I don't know, 24 boxes back in and, you know, made things functional. And then decided that there were another, I don't know how many there are, maybe there are 30, maybe there are 40 boxes still in the garage that are in the garage in a way that I can put my car in there and they're still there. Because in the meantime, I've had to reclaim the rest of my life. I'm in a pattern now of spending 1 week each month out in California with my mom. We've sold the family home of 60 years and emptied that house. I've completed my professional obligations that sort of got lost in 2013. And I've actually had a vacation, a month's vacation, which was wonderful. So sometime, maybe in the next year, I'll get back to the rest of my storehouse in the garage, which is the rest of the boxes from my basement. And in the meantime, life goes on. The other thing that happened in there, in the beginning of this year, is I would go to the homeowners association meetings and I would say, so what are we doing about drainage? And they'd say, what do you think we ought to do about drainage? So I contacted the city planning department and I got the original drainage maps from the platting of the development. And I took them to the homeowners association and I said, you know, here's the original drainage plan. And if you look at where the arrows go on the drainage plan, that's what happened. The water went straight down here. That's where the creek formed. And it went that way, and it went that way. Part of the problem is there were lakes in some of the drainage ways, and like the one outside of my place. And so those people got more flooded than other people. And some of the drainage ways didn't work as originally intended. And so the board agreed to do a walk around with these drainage plans in hand and talk with an engineer about what we needed to do. And the outcome of that meeting for me was, we need to know exactly who was flooded and to what extent. And nobody was interested in doing that. And I thought, okay, I've got to do a pilot here in my cul-de-sac. So Sally and I went around and talked to everybody in our cul-de-sac to find out whether they were not flooded, whether their carpet was wet and they took it out, or whether they kept up with the water and it was no big deal and there was no significant damage, whether their drywall got wet. And then in the process of doing that, we found that unlike my unit and Sally's unit, there were units that had water that came up from their main drain in the floor of their basement, which was a different twist.
Was this sewage? Because obviously a lot of the South Boulder areas had sewage in there, so there was some of that.
There was, well, we have to assume there was sewage in it because it was up the main drain from the drainage system. So we collected that data from every unit in our cul-de-sac, and I mapped it with color coding on a little paper map. And I took that to the next board meeting. By this time, it's June. And no, it's the end of May. The homeowners meeting at the end of May is where I took that information. And I said, don't you think it would be useful to have this kind of information for the whole development? Sally and I have done this for our cul-de-sac, and there are 4 other cul-de-sacs. So maybe other people will volunteer to do their cul-de-sacs, or somehow somebody can get together the data for the whole development. And the homeowners association manager, the person that we pay to be the manager of the HOA, said, "Oh, I can do that by email." So she did a couple of rounds of email to try to get data, and got almost all the data by doing email and some follow-up phone calls to units that hadn't responded to the email. And one of the board members does ESRI GIS mapping. And so he created a computer map of the whole development that's color-coded, that shows which units got water up through the main drain, which units got flooded and had drywall and carpet damage, which units did not flood, and remarkably, here and there, in a no defined pattern, there are units that are green on the map. It's amazing to look at that map. And we provided that data to the water engineer who's trying to help us come up with a drainage revision plan. And just, where are we now? It's September. Just at the Homeowners Association meeting this month, the water engineer provided a first draft of a maybe plan. That's 1 year after the flood. And maybe within the next 2 or 3 months, the Homeowners Association board will decide what to do. So it's going to take us at least another year or two to do anything about improving the drainage in the development.
Would you say that your neighbors are supportive of what you were a leader in establishing, trying to get this plan? Is everybody on board with it, or is there some dissension?
Well, the board's perspective is not reduce the risk of flooding. The board's perspective is what can we afford to do? They're looking at the budget. And it's the same to and fro that the city's going through of, this is expensive work. And how do we decide what we can afford to do and what needs to be done to reduce the risk of flooding, and how do you work that out and come to a constructive answer? So the Homeowners Association board is trying to figure out financially what's feasible. And the water engineer is trying to figure out what constructively can be done to reduce the risk of flooding and to convey the water off of the property rather than to soak it into basements. And I'm just trying to move the process forward rather than letting it languish and nothing be done, because I don't believe in nothing can be done. But it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Well, it sounds like there's been a lot of progress.
I think we will do some additional revisions to the drainage in the development, and the other motivating factor besides me sort of goading people on, and is that there are some other people who really feel the need for something to be done. And there's pressure from Mountain Shadows, which is the next development to the east, that got some of the water from our drainage over there because it didn't go into a detention pond as it was supposed to. So that there's pressure from neighboring development in that direction. And that'll help move things forward. But the water engineer, like everybody in professions that responded to the flood damage, is overloaded, and he doesn't need another project to do. So he's another, cog in the wheel that is moving quite slowly just because of his workload, I'm sure. I haven't talked to him directly about that, but the last time he came to a homeowners association meeting to answer questions, it was clear that he and his firm didn't have a lot of time to spend on a lot of different flood-related issues because they were on overload. So the two things about the city and the bigger picture of the community in which this development sits are, like we heard from the Katrina people after the big flooding and problems with Hurricane Katrina. You can't expect the city to take care of you in these kinds of disasters. You have to just pick up and do what you can do. And the second thing is, everybody becomes so overloaded that the timeline really stretches out for a long, long time before you can get back to where you were before the flood happened.
Now, you talked about FEMA going back for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Did you end up getting some money from them?
Oh yeah, the check was deposited. I wrote that down when I was looking at my calendar yesterday. The check was deposited by September 23rd in my bank account, because I was pretty near the front of the wave. You know, I filed the papers, I had the guy out within the week and flew off. I was gone, and there shows up the check. But the check was on the order of $3,000, and my total costs were on the order of $19,000. So it was a small pittance. And the wording in all the FEMA forms that was fascinating was, we'll provide you with money to make your home livable, your flooded home livable. Well, to make my basement livable was a little bit more than $3,000. Mm-hmm. I mean, I spent close to $1,000 by the time I flew out of town. And that was just a shell. That wasn't anything close to livable. That was trying to dry out. So in my experience, FEMA was fast and efficient, mm-hmm. but it's just a tiny fraction mm-hmm. of what's needed financially to recover from something like this. And as I've said to many friends and neighbors, mm-hmm. I just feel fortunate that I had my own financial resources to be able to, recover. And I know there are many people who weren't as fortunate, who are really struggling still. In fact, just this month, at an Open Space Board of Trustees meeting, the trustees were dealing with proposals to mitigate floods from South Boulder Creek drainage. And one of the proposals was to build a 30-foot high berm in the South Boulder Creek open space to the south of Highway 36. And that's from where Table Mesa goes on to Highway 36. Mm-hmm. They're proposing a 30-foot high berm that would go from there all the way to South Boulder Creek, which is at the end of that big wet meadow of open space that you drive through on the way into town. And there were dozens of residents from Fraser Meadows neighborhood there telling their stories of the flood. I mean, they were really, really disastrous stories. And those people were hit much harder than we were. And so that experience this month gave me another neighborhood's perspective into this whole thing and what's still going on and what they're still trying to do to recover. They not only got hit much harder, but you can just imagine the financial implications of that for them and their lives, and the emotional trauma too. And you, from being part of that process, I can see, like I was saying, the pulls and tugs of the city with how to deal with flood mitigation from the city level. Because in some cases it's easy to say, okay, we can make a detention pond here in the golf course. That's kind of a no-brainer. But then the question is, do we build on our open space lands to mitigate floods, or are there other alternatives? And there are something like 14 other alternatives that haven't thoroughly been analyzed yet. And I'm hoping that instead of building on our open space lands to control future floodwaters, we'll be able to do multiple smaller projects that instead of one big berm across open space, we can build or construct ways to deal with water in smaller, further up drainages and therefore reduce impacts. But the city's going to be struggling with this for years, both in terms of what to do and how to pay for it. Mm-hmm. And that's all got to be a bigger community process.
So have we covered most of what you would like to emphasize about this?
I can't think of anything else right now.
Okay. Anything that surprised you during the whole process?
Surprised me. Another lifetime experience. I'm old enough at this point that life generally doesn't surprise me anymore. I've lived through 71 years of experiences, and some are bigger than others. This is bigger than most, for sure.
And you mentioned some positive in the response of friends and neighbors and community. Yeah. Anything else that you would say pro or con about that experience?
I think the way a community lives is just really reflected and magnified in these kinds of situations. I mean, I knew my neighbors because I go door to door for voter registration and to get out the vote during election time. But because I knew neighbors, when I showed up at their door screaming, "Get your shovel and come out here," they knew who I was. And I think having communities that live and work together leads to more sustainable and resilient communities. And I think that showed its face during this flood.
All right. Well, we really appreciate this, Karen. Thank you so much for doing the interview.
You're welcome.